With the Canadian election coming up, there is a lot to talk about. So I have on historian and YouTuber Christo Aivalis. Christo, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot to go through. As I said, there's an election coming up. Trudeau hasn't called it yet. Before we even get to any topics, actually, when do you think Trudeau will call the election? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, basically, with the Fair Elections Act, it basically means that instead of the 5-year window that Canada has constitutionally, it's a 4-year window. And usually the Prime Minister has to call the election within a sort of 2-week window, give or take. It's not an exact set date, but it's more or less like in these couple weeks, you have to call an election. And so I think the consensus is that it could be this week that he'll go to the Governor General and ask for Parliament to be dissolved, thus starting the election, or it could be the week after where it'll be a little bit less of an election window, because elections can be longer or shorter in Canada, and that's important because it determines election spending amounts, both in general and at the riding level. And if the Liberals feel that the Tories have a bit more money than them, they feel they might get an advantage by a slightly shorter window. So maybe you might see Justin Trudeau call it next week, although the internal calculus is something I don't have a direct pulse on. So it'll come this week or next week.
Yeah, and that's just for the American viewers out there. I mean, in contrast to their elections, where it's like years at a time running for president, it's kind of crazy that our election is I mean, in comparison to them, it's crazy that our election is so short. But I mean, I guess there are positive and negatives to that. How do you feel about that, just in general, that our elections are shorter than American elections?
Yeah, I mean, in official terms, because again, with the U.S., it's like
Yeah.
every November they have elections, and it's like sometimes it's all it's a third of the Senate, and then the House, and then the presidency half the time, and then you got state elections, and they have a regimented like November schedule. Canada elections can happen anytime in any way. And with a majority government, we have this weird scenario. A majority government basically means it'll almost always run 4 years, maybe a little bit less if if there's no Fair Elections Act in the province. And so, we don't have the formal election starting, but we sort of have this informal election period. So
Yeah.
Canada in some ways has been in election mode since the spring, more or less. But in Canada, the formal writ period is very important. And the writ period is the period between the time that the Governor General or Lieutenant Governor, this is all fancy Canadian talk, you know what I mean? But like
Yeah.
all these terms that basically the Prime Minister says we're having an election, it'll be 6 weeks from now. And so for those 6 weeks, laws around third party advertising change, laws around campaign financing change, laws around media conduct change. And so we have these pre-election periods to have election style politics, but then we have a very formalized 6 or so week window. Now, it can be longer. For the Canadians, you might remember that Stephen Harper did like the 12-week window back in 2015, which was the longest election in Canadian history since like the days in which you actually needed to like take a train like through the wilderness to actually visit the whole country. So you needed like 12 weeks to actually run a national campaign. So and they did that because they had more money and they wanted to maximize their ability to spend. Because again, the longer the election period, that's what determines the spending limits at the various levels of the campaign. So it's all very complicated in that sense versus the American system, which the perpetual campaign, especially at the Congress level, especially at the House level, I think is rather corrosive. But people know on the first week of November every year I got a vote to cast, right? We don't have that certainty in Canada.
Yeah. So let's get a little deeper now into some topics here. So there was a recent Forum Research poll showing that the majority of Canadians have a positive view of socialism, with 58% positive and 40% negative. What did you take away from this poll?
I mean, the headline sounds great, and it is great. I mean, despite generations of demonization of socialism and of the left in general, and all of this, that we see in the media, like, oh, you want to make Canada into Venezuela or whatever. the fact that socialism is effectively seen as positive by almost like a super majority of Canadians is great. But I think that people only read the headline of that. And then, as my video on this topic noted, 58% of people and 42, it's literally exactly mirrored, have the positive view of capitalism. And so I think what it shows is that Canadians are maybe ideologically confused. And I think it shows that Canadians, maybe more than Americans, are sort of reading in a version of socialism and capitalism that fits what they want from a worldview. So, for instance, I think for capitalism, a lot of people are reading into that, free markets, and they're reading into that, opportunity to succeed and opportunity to get ahead. When, of course, as we know, capitalism requires none of that. Capitalism is about private control of industry. And likewise, I think a lot of people maybe don't talk about socialism in terms of, more of the class conscious element of it. And they consider socialism to be social programs and things like that. It's no surprise then that 60% would agree, even though, maybe they don't really have an innate understanding of what democratic socialist vision for Canada would be. And I think that's what's really interesting about that polling. Of course, there's other interesting facts like, if you live in certain regions, if you're lower income, you're more likely to support socialism than capitalism. If you're highly educated, you're more likely to support socialism. Lower education supports capitalism. So it's this weird dichotomy where, high-income people, sort of don't like capitalism, but then, or don't like socialism, excuse me. But you're seeing a divide amongst, low and middle-income people depending on their levels of education. So if you're like a blue-collar, middle-class person in terms of income, you might have this negative view of socialism, whereas university-educated people have a positive view of socialism. And maybe that's due, in fact, to, I feel, what cuts beyond, the right-wing media of the country, that you get, a better opportunity to read about what democratic socialism has been and can be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes into the next topic I want to touch on here, which is the NDP's wealth tax. So there was a recent Abacus poll showing that 67% of Canadians support or somewhat support a wealth tax. What are your thoughts on that poll, and also just the lack of overall media coverage on this issue as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, that poll, I made a video about that a couple months ago. That poll was done through North 99 and Ricochet. Ricochet is one of the best online sources for Canadian left media. So, definitely read that if you're looking for, good coverage. Especially, they do a lot of work on Indigenous issues, which is, especially important. But they did a poll, and they found that basically 2/3 of Canadians support a wealth tax, similar in nature to what Jagmeet Singh has proposed, and sort of similar in a broad sense to what you're seeing from Warren and Sanders in the United States. The numbers are different. Singh's is 1% and it starts at 20 million. The American ones start at a higher amount. But on the whole, they're similar policies. But what was really crucial about this is it wasn't just 2/3 of Canadians. It was basically everybody from every demographic. Even the most conservative province like Alberta, a majority of people supported it. And a majority of people planning to vote for the Conservative Party in this election support it as well. So it's not just non-conservatives support this policy, which isn't that surprising. It's that almost everybody, almost every demographic back it. And you'd think paradoxically, old people are seen as conservative, but older people were the most likely to support a wealth tax according to this poll. So it shows that, if you want a policy that elderly people like, because elderly people get to those polls, maybe a wealth tax is one of them. And I think it's so crucial that it demonstrates that, taxing the rich is popular. It's unambiguously popular. It's popular even with people who vote for parties that proudly declare they love the rich, right? Because I think people realize society is unfair. And people have different visions about how to address that unfairness. And sometimes those visions are literally diametrically opposed. But there's a feeling that society is unfair. And I think taxing the rich is at least a solution that everyone can in different ways get behind. And I think a wealth tax links them. And I think that, as I noted in one of my more recent videos as well, is that, Linda McQuaig at Toronto Star wrote a piece. I know you talked about it in one of your recent live streams where she notes this and says, well, why isn't the Canadian media covering this? And I think it's pretty simple. is the Canadian media doesn't represent the average Canadian. It doesn't, right? Remember the Globe and Mail a few years ago basically said, we really have a target audience of people making 100 grand a year or more, which is not the average Canadian by any means. Mm-hmm. And I think that they have a vested economic and like political interest in not talking about things like a wealth tax, both because the owners of those media and the people who benefit from the coverage in that media don't want a wealth tax, but also because it's a way to differentiate the NDP from the Liberals. And I don't think that these sources want to see a strong NDP because that strikes at the political and social and economic status quo. So when there's good news about the NDP, this is a popular policy that only the NDP supports. The Greens don't support it. The Conservatives don't support it. The Liberals don't support it. And it's popular. If you let people know that, maybe they'll look and say, well, maybe Jagmeet Singh has more good ideas. And I don't think the media is interested. And as you know, this is what they do with Bernie. Bernie has objectively popular policies, and sometimes he's the only one with them, and they just don't mention them, right? Because it doesn't serve the interests of the media in question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a point that I feel Jagmeet Singh could absolutely talk about again and again and again, whether it's in a debate, whether he's just on television being interviewed. Mention the fact that a majority of Canadians, including a majority of conservative voters, support a wealth tax, and that you're not talking about it. The media's not talking about it. These politicians aren't talking about it. I mean, that is a point that really gets to the heart of what many Canadians are feeling, which is that the media doesn't represent them, but they aren't really sure how to pinpoint that. But when you have a poll like this showing the data, that the data is on the side of the NDP, yet it's not being discussed in the press, I mean, this is a huge selling point for Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, and I hope he latches on to this and other figures that also support his policies.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, I totally agree. I think, of course, like they could always be doing more to talk about this. Sorry, that was my cat there. I'm just gonna. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Really apologize. I'm just gonna put him over here. That caused it. So sorry about that. You'll probably have to cut that.
No, it's all good.
Unless we want to leave it in as a candid moment.
Yeah,
but no, I mean, I totally agree that the NDP could be doing more to popularize this data, and I think it's crucial because again, one of the things that's challenging for the Canadian left, in a way that's not really for Bernie, is that like the Liberals will put forward policies that sound great, but that you got to kind of dig into them sometimes to find out the limitations. So the Liberals will say, well, we taxed the rich. We raised income taxes on the rich in 2015, which is technically true. The benefits of that went to the top 10%. So they took from the top 1 and gave to the rest of the 9%. And it was only income. But I think people need to realize that, the NDP is talking about taxing wealth. And that's something that goes beyond income, because the richest people, they don't make most of their income from labor. Maybe like doctors and lawyers and some highly paid professionals do, but like really, really wealthy people, they don't make their money like at a 9-to-5 job. And it's the same thing with capital gains. The NDP wants to, take the capital gains, taxation level from 50% of income to 75%. So right now, if you make 100 grand in Canada through selling stocks, you pay less in taxes than if somebody made $75,000 a year as a teacher or a nurse or what have you.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, because income is taxed at full rate and capital gains only at 50%. The NDP is going to take that to 75. I think they should go to 100, but I think that's a good first step. And this is a fundamental difference between the Liberals and the NDP, or really the NDP and the Liberals and the Greens and the Conservatives and the PPC, if we want to throw them in too. But it's a fundamental difference, and the NDP does have to do a better job at selling these things, but I think the media needs to do their job and give Canadians an informed choice. No party is owed an endorsement by the media. No party is owed positive coverage by the media. But the media, I think, owes it to the public to give people all the information that's relevant and let the people make a decision, right? And I don't think we're getting that in regards to some of the differentiations between the NDP and the Liberals, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move into slogans now. This is for some reason a big thing in Canada. So let me go through each of the party slogans that, at least the major parties that we know so far. So the Liberal slogan is "Choose Forward." The Conservatives have "It's time for you to get ahead." The Greens have "Not left, not right, forward together," which there's some controversy around that. And the NDP now just released theirs, and it's "In it for you." So what do you, I don't know, what do you think of these slogans, and what do you think of the NDP's decision here? Do you think it correctly identifies, I guess, what the party is fighting for in this election?
I mean, none of the slogans are bangers, right? Like,
Yeah, I know.
like none of them are.
Some of them are like
I
full
mean,
sentences, like.
yeah, like I mean, well, we can go through them all. Like the Tory one to me, like it seems almost like it's selfish. Maybe that's what they're based. It's like it's time for you to get ahead, but like ahead of who? Like your fellow Canadians, like
Yeah,
your
that's
neighbors,
yeah.
your sister-in-laws, like, and her bragging about their new house. Like what does that
Yeah.
mean, right? Like I get the point. It's like we're gonna cut your taxes and we're gonna increase your opportunity. Like I get that's Tory messaging, but it
Yeah.
comes off really bad. The Liberal one almost seems like it's a bit of a ripoff of the Green one, which is sort of connected to Andrew Yang's statement, which is like not left, not right, but forward. The Liberals don't have the left-right thing, but it's like we're moving in the correct direction. And
Yeah.
that the Greens, it's the same thing, right? Like not left, not right, forward. That and I think like they're trying to say like this isn't about ideology. This is about progress in a generalized sense. I mean, I guess they're better than the Tory one, but I'm not inspired. And the Greens, I think, are making a big mistake. I like the Greens see themselves as, and they in reality are, basically a centrist party. But Canadians don't see them like that. And if you look at like who considers voting Green and who Green voters consider voting for, it's almost like Green voters overwhelmingly right now. There was an Abacus poll done like a month ago that asked you, like, if you're not going to vote for the party you're currently voting for, who would you vote for? It's like 40% of Greens would vote for the NDP, which is clearly a left of center party. Like the Greens, like the messaging doesn't fit like where their opportunities lie, which is like to challenge the NDP, right? So
Yeah.
finally, the NDP one is like In It For You. I think it's decent. I mean, it still sounds a little individualistic. Like it's like I like Bernie's kind of like not me, like like not me,
Yeah.
us. Like I
Yeah,
like
that's a
that.
great
I don't know
slogan.
if you
Yeah.
can copy that directly because
I
then
know.
it's like you're doing what the Liberals did to the Greens. But
Yeah.
In It For You, I think is pretty good because it's like politics doesn't represent you, and the NDP is reaching out to low income people and young people and marginalized people and working class people who have felt left out and have felt that Justin Trudeau didn't keep his promises, like Indigenous people, for instance. And Jagmeet Singh and the team are in it for you. And I guess the implication, and also people that you love and people like you in your community. So I think it's probably the best, but like none of them are going to ruin or make a campaign. Like they're really
Yeah.
all kind of in the mushy middle.
Yeah, let's hope people pay a little more attention to these parties than just the slogans.
Yeah.
So that, you are just voting for somebody or voting for a party because of the slogan. But let's look at the state of the race now in terms of polling. So the CBC poll tracker right now, last I checked, has the Conservatives at 34%, the Liberals at 33.3%, and the NDP at 12.8%. Now, a lot of the media coverage, I mean, so far, naturally, when it comes to the NDP, has been extraordinarily negative. I mean, I have a hard time finding a positive piece about the NDP unless it's written by somebody in the NDP. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's really hard to kind of see or have an objective view on what these parties represent or what they're trying to represent. But yeah, so just in terms of the polling here at first, what are your thoughts so far on, I guess, how this race will start with the Conservatives and the Liberals sort of tied and the NDP trailing far behind?
Yeah, I mean, with polling, I think it needs to be said very clearly that, especially with the NDP results, there's a wide disagreement with what the polls are. One recent poll by Ecos has the party at 7-8%. Now that poll is by almost 4.5 points lower than the next lowest poll done this month, which has the NDP at 12. And then there are still polls done this month that have the NDP at 14 and 15 and 17 and 18. Now, the CBC poll tracker has averaging done that includes recency of poll, size of poll, all of those things. I'm not going to criticize the methodology, but the average of the CBC poll being at 12.8 is lower than over half the polls. And you can make of that what you will, but the NDP could be sitting in the mid-teens right now, or they could be sitting in the low teens right now. We really don't know. But I think you're right that the coverage has tried to create a narrative of collapse that may not be there. And they've talked about the candidates not being nominated fast enough, which is always an NDP thing. For better or worse, the NDP wants women and people of color and working class people and indigenous people to run for our party. And we ensure that in every nomination possible, that if there's that a person from an equity-seeking group runs for the nomination. We don't guarantee any wins. We don't have a quota. But, if somebody who doesn't fit an equity group is the only nominee, the party will task the riding association with the effort to demonstrate that they've reached out to women and young people and otherwise marginalized people. And that takes time. And maybe some people think that's a bad thing, but I think it's a good thing that the party tries to have a slate of candidates that reflects the nature of Canada and not, 270 lawyers,
Yeah, absolutely.
Who all have six-figure incomes. Like that's not, or just a group of candidates that a leader largely selected themselves from the central office. I mean, that's the reality. And of course, at some point, the nominations will have to become more flexible. And the NDP always runs a full slate of candidates and is always behind. And again, the coverage isn't noting this with context. And I think that, in a sense, more needs to be said about how, the coverage is, I think, more negative than it should be. And you're right in noting that it's hard to get good coverage. I mean, I've noted this before to you, both in our discussions on the channel and otherwise, that I have to go to Washington Post to write some positive pieces about the NDP sometimes.
Yeah.
And I mean, the toughest interview Justin Trudeau's gotten in the last 4 years has been by Hassan Minhaj.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that on just on Patriot Act, just this past weekend.
Yeah.
Jagmeet Singh gets much tougher interviews, and he's the leader of a third party. In terms of polling, we're in a really interesting position overall. Right now, both the Liberals and Tories are sub 35, basically. That is very rare to have both of the two main parties below 35, and it's looking like that means a minority government. It could be an awkward situation because the Liberals are polling good specifically in Quebec and Ontario. And if that happens, you might have a situation where the Tories, win the popular vote, but don't have as many seats because they have all of these wasted votes in Alberta and Saskatchewan where they're running up 30-40% majorities in rural Alberta and rural Saskatchewan and rural Manitoba. And the Liberals are winning close races in Ontario and Quebec, showing greater voter efficiency. So right now, we're looking at a minority government, and the NDP has been the only party that has said, they're not going to support the Conservatives in a minority government. So the NDP could form a kind of coalition with the Liberals to enact positive reforms like electoral reform, dental care, pharmacare, and what have you. Other than that, I mean, we've seen, for instance, that if the Conservatives can get close to a majority, they may or may not be able to get support from either Elizabeth May and the Greens or from the Bloc Québécois, depending on the issues. Now, Greens have been very mad at me for reminding them about this, but Elizabeth May has said so herself, that she would consider making Andrew Scheer prime minister if he gave her things on the climate. So I think that if Canadians don't want a Conservative prime minister and they want a Liberal government that's actually accountable to their promises, I think the goal has to be like a minority government where the NDP holds the balance of power. I think that's probably the most likely option, and it's like an achievable option too.
Yeah, absolutely. Just this one point I guess I want to touch on, because I saw it come up today. It seemed ridiculous to me, so I want you to comment on this. But there was it was either a story or it was commentary on a story saying that the NDP is potentially polling so low that they could lose party status. Now, to me, this sounds like an idea that is an attempt to put out there in a way to get people to not support the NDP and kind of just think about voting for the Liberals. But what are your thoughts on that? Is that actually a potential that could happen, that they could lose party status?
I mean, like, at the end of the day, the polling aggregates right now do not reflect that. One poll in particular, again, that's an extreme outlier on the NDP at least, does indicate that the party would lose a bunch of seats. But the aggregates in general indicate that the NDP will get somewhere between 15 and like 25 seats. That's a decline from 2015, but party status is 12 seats in Canada. And And so that's a major factor. I think that that's a likely result with the polling as it is. And I would be very surprised to see the party lose party status because the NDP has great strengths in pockets of this country, and they have great activist bases, and they're running fantastic candidates there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that happening. And I see, for instance, right now, if the polling is to be believed, losses in places like Quebec, but there are potential pickups in places like St. John's East and Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. There are strong NDP candidates who lost in 2015, sometimes in very close races, running again. I would be very surprised to see that. And I would agree that some of these pollsters who have ideological biases, much like I do, to be fair, would very much like to see a narrative in which the NDP disappears because I think, have liberal leanings in their polls. And this narrative that the NDP is done for serves the political thing. And this is where polling can become biased. I'm not going to accuse pollsters of cooking their own numbers. I wouldn't do that. But it's like how you interpret that data and how you contextualize that data can be biased, and how narratives are written by what your polling is showing can be biased. And I think those polls are indicating something that hasn't been seen by the majority of pollsters thus far. I mean, again, Ipsos came out with a poll this month that had the NDP at 18. The NDP in 2015 got 19. So in effect, it's within the margin of error. Now, the polls are to be believed because of the NDP's decline in Quebec. That might leave the NDP with quite a few less seats, even though they effectively tied their popular vote. But it does mean that the party collapse narrative isn't so much a reality as much as it is, how first past the post works depending on how your vote spreads, which is a more complicated narrative.
Yeah. I also just think, lack of media coverage right now is also a big factor. I think once these campaigns really get rolling, then you're going to see Jagmeet Singh and other NDP candidates on television more often. You're going to see more discussion around each of the parties as opposed to focusing, hopefully, more discussion around each of the parties as opposed to just focusing on the Conservatives and the Liberals. So I think that media coverage will also help as well, especially because, as we've seen, like the wealth tax, the NDP proposals are popular. So getting that out in front of Canadians, I think, will also help boost their numbers. But Christo, thanks again for coming on. And where can people find you?
People can find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's just at Twitter. It's at Christo Aivalis, Christo Aivalis. David will have the spelling on there. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'll have it all below the video as well.
And then YouTube, you can just find me. The YouTube channel is Christo Aivalis. I got some recent videos on American politics and Canadian politics, a few videos that have talked about these things. I have a Patreon, of course. This is Christo Aivalis as well. But, check out the channel. I think if you like David's stuff, you'll probably like my stuff.
Yeah, Christo's doing awesome work. Definitely check out his channel. I'll have the links below. Hit the button and subscribe to his channel. And thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.